thank you all for being here. I really want to thank Joe and First Person Plural and Dean Rutherford and the Clinton School and the S.E. Peirce Museum for sponsoring me, inviting me and sponsoring me to come here. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Southern Oral History Program and the project we did on the Long Women's Movement that inspired Joe, and then shift to talking about my contribution to that project, which is a study of very recent feminist activism, some in North Carolina and the South, but also nationally, which has resulted in this book that we have here called Speaking of Feminism. So let me start by telling you about the wonderful place where I get to go to work every day, which is the Southern Oral History Program, which is located here in the Center for the Study of the American South at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. We're on the very sort of corner, the edge of the UNC campus, and we call ourselves, for obvious reasons, the front porch of the university. We really try to be a place that is welcoming and open to not just people within the academy, but the community more broadly. And we really try to be a place where we are making the research and the teaching and the things that go on at the university accessible and relevant to much broader audiences. So as a part of that, the Southern Oral History Program, which as Joe said has been around for 50 years, we really are the arm of the center that is most actively engaged in producing scholarship. We also at the center have a wonderful journal, which if you don't already know about it, is called Southern Cultures. It's a fabulous interdisciplinary journal that is really aimed, again, at crossing that academic and community public audience and making very complex and powerful ideas available to people well beyond a university. It publishes poetry and fiction, as well as history and music and all kinds of things. But at the Southern Oral History Program, we are engaged in doing high-quality, community-engaged scholarship on the ever-changing South. We go out and interview people. As Joe said, we've been doing this for 50 years, interviewing people from all walks of life, all across the South, about the political, economic, environmental, social changes that have happened in the South. And we're talking to people both about how they have helped make that change and how those changes have shaped their lives. We train students and community members to do oral history. And as Joe mentioned, we really try to make our archives, we don't want these interviews to just sit on the shelf, right? All of them are digitally available, both the audio and the transcripts. So what that means is any of you can go online and listen to any of these 8,000 interviews that we've done, some of which, we were interviewing people back in the 70s who were in their 80s and 90s, and so their memories go way, way back. We have interviews with women who were actually going out and trying to get the right to vote, which is appropriate to remember in this year. So our collections have focused on civil rights movement, social justice movements more broadly, economic movements, labor, all kinds of things. And as Joe mentioned, we had when I first arrived, I arrived at the Southern Oral History Program in 2011. And they were actually just finishing up a major research push, a major couple of years of collecting about the women's movement in the South. And the question really, if you read women's history, you might notice that most of the books and things that have been written about the feminist movement have taken place in New York, maybe California, a few more recently in the Midwest, but there really was almost nothing written about the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s in the South. And we really wanted to go out and interview people, not just women who identified as feminists or who had kind of been active in the feminist movement in the 70s, but just people who experienced that, and to kind of get a sense of both those who participated actively, but also those for whom it was maybe something that was going on over here, but it shaped the way that they experienced their lives. The stories that came out of that were powerful. We had many beautiful stories. I actually don't know how to go backwards, but you saw some of the images of the women that we talked to, many of whom were living in very rural areas, and Barb Green was one of the women we talked to. She talked about how at the time she didn't think of herself as a feminist, because to her that was those New York women who were, trying to break down glass ceilings. And she said, glass ceilings, really? Like, what does that mean, right? That has nothing to do with my life. But over time, she came to think of herself as a grassroots feminist, and as someone who she said, we're more about place, we're more about the land, we're more about family, we're more about justice beyond just what is right for me and mine, but what is right for everyone. And she was incredibly eloquent about, to her, what that meant. So since then, we have been trying to share those inspiring voices that came out of that project in a variety of ways. One of which has been for K-12 classrooms. We know that there's a lot of teachers out there who are wanting to add women's history into their classrooms, but you may know that the textbooks and things still don't do a very good job of this. And so we made a map of North Carolina and embedded oral history clips in it, so teachers all across the state could click on a place near them and listen to women's voices from that area. I'm really passionate about the idea that I think a lot of kids think history happened long ago and far away to people not like me. And if they can actually hear the voices of people from their communities who sound and look just like them, actually, it totally transforms the way they think about the past and the way they think about their own role in their community and in the ability to make a difference. We've also been sharing these voices. This is Women Advance is a statewide organization that holds an annual meeting, kind of conference, and we have been working with them to share some of these voices. So around the same time that I came to the Southern Oral History program, I was at the time teaching a class at Duke University. I was thrilled when I came in and Sherman James, whose office was down the hall from me at Duke, showed up in here, which was a lovely surprise. I was teaching a class at Duke called Women's Leadership History, Theory, and Practice. And so we were studying the history of how women had tried to make change in the world over the last 100 years. Everything that they tried to do, right? Letter writing campaigns, petitions, street theater, the Guerrilla Girls art movement, labor activism, all kinds of things. And we were reading theory about feminism and social change and how people make change. And then the practice part. Their final project was that it was a small class, a seminar of about 13, 14 students every year. Their final project was they had to agree on a topic, an issue that they wanted to make change on. They had to come to consensus. They had to figure out how were they going to exercise leadership on some issue that they cared about. How were they actually going to go out there and make change? And it is a lot harder to put your money where your mouth is, right? They're so used to kind of critiquing how someone else does it, or they should have done this, or they should have done that. But when you actually have to, figure out how to make change, it forces you to learn, what are the power structures out there? If I want to change this little thing, what is the lever that I need to pull on to make that change happen? Who has influence? Who has money? All of these things that they have to figure out. So 2012 was a kind of remarkable moment. It was, if you remember, the year of the war on women. There was a campaign going on. There was Trayvon Martin had just been shot. There was Rush Limbaugh on air excoriating Sandra Fluke as a slut because she had asked for, she had stood up in front of Congress and said that health insurance should cover birth control, and he spent weeks calling her a slut. That was when Todd Aiken said that if a woman was legitimately raped, the body had a way of shutting that whole thing down, so basically you couldn't get pregnant if you had been raped. There was all kinds of stuff going on. And in our classroom, we were having these really wonderful, intense conversations about all of this stuff. When they went out of the classroom onto Duke's campus and tried to have similar conversations, they were routinely told to shut up, go away, we don't need feminism anymore, you're too angry, you're too, I don't want to hear this, move on, right? And they would come back into the classroom and they said, if we literally can't talk about these things, how are we supposed to make any progress on anything, right? We literally can't talk about it. So they decided that what they wanted to do was open up a space, a rhetorical space on Duke's campus to actually talk about feminism. They wanted other students to learn what we had been learning in class. And so what they did was they went out on campus with this whiteboard and a black marker, and they asked people to fill out the whiteboard with signs. Just answer the question, I need feminism because. And they stood out on the main quad, and you probably can't read these things, but his says, I need feminism absolutely because I know the intersectionality of oppression. He's wearing his hood in direct reference to Trayvon Martin, right? And he's saying, I need all the allies I can get to fight for justice in every possible way. She says, I need feminism because I don't want to apologize for my strong opinions. And students just came by and filled this out in many different ways. Students from all different backgrounds, athletes, poets, men, women, people of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And the students, so one group had been out there collecting these photos. Someone was taking photographs of them. Another group had been raising money. So when they had enough photographs, they went to a print shop and they got these turned into huge posters. And another group wrote an op-ed to the student newspaper. So at about 3 o'clock in the morning one night, they ran around campus putting up these posters, and the next morning their op-ed ran in the newspaper explaining why they thought they needed to do this. And it worked. There was a lot of conversation about feminism on Duke's campus. And a lot of it was wonderful, excitement, but there was also a lot of debate. And there were guys who were running around putting sticky notes on these posters saying things like, go make me a sandwich, or pulling them down and stomping on them. And the students, my students, actually caught some of them on camera. And as a kind of afterthought, they put these posters up on Facebook. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen something, like watch something go viral, but you know on Facebook you can see the number of likes. I was watching this, literally the number of likes was going, I mean, just exponentially growing. Within hours, there were thousands of likes, and it was traveling literally around the world. And then, so one student said, oh, I was so busy taking these pictures of other people, I forgot I wanted to do it myself. And instead of doing the whole whiteboard thing, she just wrote on a piece of paper and took a picture of herself with her computer and posted that. And it was like that opened the floodgates. So not only were people liking what we did, but people started sending in their own photographs from around the world. These, they came from India, Saudi Arabia, New Zealand, you know, and we had a map. Pretty soon I could see from Google Analytics that within 3 weeks, this thing had been seen in every country in the world except for about 3. It was remarkable. I've never seen anything like it. And thousands of these posters started coming in. People started asking us, when is the Who Needs Feminism bus coming to our campus? And so on the previous slide, you saw my students made a kind of guide for how to do Who Needs Feminism on your campus, and they sent that out to hundreds of campuses around the world. Now, in some ways, these students, they had been studying history, and in some ways there were many echoes of the past, right? To put your photograph up online is in some ways like putting a button on your backpack or your jean jacket. It is in some ways like joining a march, although much quieter, which is actually something we talked about. Here's that map. You can't see it very well, but it obviously was using the tools of the present in new ways. And it garnered a lot of attention. The students won awards. They were written about in BuzzFeed, in Ms. Magazine, and in all kinds of things. And it was really quite remarkable. Now, looking back, as a historian now, looking back, I think we've got enough distance. We can see that 2012 was actually something of a watershed moment. It wasn't just our students. It was a moment when feminist women started using the internet in new ways. That was the same year, for instance, you remember when the Komen Foundation said they were no longer going to support Planned Parenthood, and there was just this outpouring of rage from women across the country, and they had to backtrack, and Planned Parenthood actually ended up getting millions of dollars. And so there were many things going on. I don't argue that our students kind of created this, but they certainly were contributing to this moment where people were thinking about the internet in new ways and its power for specifically feminist kinds of activism. It was my little 15 minutes of fame. I remember one time I was walking down the street and someone introduced me to a young woman as the sort of founder of Who Needs Feminism, and she said, "Oh, you're the one who started the revolution," which of course was not true, but it was a cute comment, and spoke to young people's investment in this. And that was what was so remarkable to me, that we were in a moment where so many people were telling young women that we don't need feminism anymore, shut up and go away, but there was such a hunger for this, and there were so many people around the world who cared deeply about it. And so I had not been very engaged in social media. I had a Facebook page that I think mainly my mom, was reading, but I had not been on Twitter. I didn't really know what Tumblr was. I wasn't particularly engaged. And my students and this project made me really want to understand more what is this and what does it mean for activism and how are people using it and is it a force for good or not? Because in addition to the wonderful kind of outpouring of energy and creativity and excitement, my students and I also experienced the dark underbelly of the internet and social media at the same time. And so there was horrific stuff that was coming at them, and we had to have multiple class meetings set aside to just kind of process, help them think about what does this mean, how do they handle this, do they want, some of it was just the stupid go make me a sandwich stuff, but some of it was downright scary and violent. And so we had to have these conversations about, do you want this site to be kind of open for all debate, or do you want it to be a safe space for people to talk about these issues? How are you going to handle, for a while they were literally dividing the day up into 2-hour increments so that they could keep an eye on the Facebook page and kind of delete the really nasty stuff. But that just was not sustainable. You couldn't keep that going. Anyway, so I wanted to understand both the promise and the peril of what was happening. So I started my own new interviewing project, and I interviewed relatively young feminist activists around the country. I get to call them young because they were all my age or younger. But basically, I was interested in people who, like me, came of age in the 1980s during Reagan years. So remember, we had the 60s and the 70s, a big kind of feminist outpouring, and then the Reagan years was a period of intense backlash. And that is when you started to get this phrase, we don't need feminism anymore, right? You had your sort of feminist moment, we're done, you got everything that you wanted, it's time to, be quiet. And so I was really interested in how did people who came of age during that time or after find their way to feminism. It's certainly not kind of in the popular culture in a way that would make that obvious. And I was interested in how they came to it. I was interested in, I wasn't interviewing just people who said, yeah, I'm a feminist. I was interviewing people I called professional feminists. These were people who were making a living, or at least putting all of their energy, and it wasn't always a very good living, into feminist work of one sort or another. So these were journalists, media activists, grassroots activists, sort of direct service organization leaders, nonprofit leaders, some labor activists, some academics, a wide variety of people, but for whom feminism was their core commitment, and this is what they were really trying to do. And I talked to them in different areas around the country. So mostly all urban areas where I knew that there were kind of clusters of feminist organizations. I did not, for sort of, Joe mentioned that I'm a very pragmatic and practical person, and so I needed to go places where in 1 week I could get a whole bunch of interviews. I couldn't go to sort of rural areas and drive miles and miles and have to find people and stuff. So I am very glad that the SOHP has those amazing collections of rural women's feminist activism, but that's not what I was focused on. And in the end, I interviewed people who were in their 40s, 30s, and 20s. And in the end, I actually divided the book up into chapters based on those age cohorts, which was not my original plan. But it turned out that there were amazing kind of themes and connections that were rising up in these age cohorts that I found really fascinating, and that if you read, so the first chapter is the oldest women and down to the youngest. If you read in that way, you get this sense of how the movement is changing and what is happening with the younger and younger people. The people in their 40s, none of them had studied, or almost none of them, one maybe, none of them had studied women's studies in college. They were in college in the 80s. Women's studies existed, but it wasn't really very prevalent on college campuses until more like the 90s. And so most of them had really never taken a women's studies class. They did not come out of college saying, I want to be a professional feminist. They came out of college, got jobs. Most of them, in fact, had not participated in any kind of feminist activism during college. It was really in the workplace that when they ran into pretty severe sexism and other things, that they started thinking in this way. And they actually created new types of jobs that didn't exist before. Not only, and what that meant was they created a sort of niche for themselves, but also for a lot of the younger people who came up behind them. So this is Rebecca Traister, the one with the baby. If you don't already follow Rebecca Traister and you're interested in feminist commentary, she is one of the best voices on kind of American politics and culture through a feminist lens. She had started out as a journalist, working in newspapers that she thought were wonderful but really old boys clubs. She said, if you had asked me when I was 25 years old if I wanted to be a feminist journalist, I would have said that thing does not exist. So she, in the early, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, with another group of women editors at Salon, do you remember the online magazine Salon? They started a new feminist blog. I think it was called Broadsheet, is that right? Something like that. It was it was one of the first national mainstream kind of feminist commentary places, and it became very popular. And what that did was it proved to editors that there were audiences out there who were hungry for this stuff. And so ever since then, there have been more and more journalists for whom covering the world through a feminist lens actually now is a job. The Boston Globe just hired a gender reporter. So there's more and more of this, and Rebecca and other people like her were some of the ones who made that possible. I was really interested in the women I interviewed in their 30s who, you've heard the term the sandwich generation. Usually we think of that as women who are, caring for young children and their elderly parents. So it's a term we use for care at home. These young women were experiencing this at work. So many of them were the executive directors. This is Erin Parrish. She had been the executive director of the Minnesota Women's Coalition and Consortium, Minnesota Women's Consortium, which is a kind of umbrella organization for the entire state that lots and lots of small feminist and just women's nonprofits are a part of it. And it had been founded in the 80s by women who were now in their 70s and 80s. who were still the major donors. They were still the most reliable volunteers. They, you know, it was really important to keep them happy and engaged and active. But in order to make this organization continue, she also needed to recruit younger people. And she was very aware of the fact that there was often some conflict there, that the younger people wanted everything on Twitter and online, and the older people wanted their handwritten thank you notes on cards. And, you know, she was really struggling to manage meeting the needs and expectations of both of them. And I found that to be a repeated theme that came up for some of these folks. And then the younger people that I talked to were just astounding. And the phrase that kept coming up with them was, I want to change the conversation. And so here on your left, that's Andrea Pino. Andrea had graduated from the University of North Carolina. Well, actually, when I talked to her, she had not yet quite graduated. She had been a student at the University of North Carolina. She was a first-generation Cuban, her family were Cuban immigrants from Little Havana in Miami. She was unbelievably driven. She came from a family and a neighborhood where almost no one went to college, and she just, you know, got herself up at 4 a.m. so that she could go take community college classes, so that she could get the kind of work that she couldn't get at her high school. She just, through complete force of will, got herself to UNC. She loved UNC. She was thrilled about it. And then she was the victim of a pretty brutal sexual assault. And she eventually, with another student who had also been sexually assaulted, they sued North Carolina under Title IX. So we think of Title IX, you know, it's the law that says any institution, any university that gets federal funds has to provide equal opportunities for men and women. And usually we think of that as how we got women's sports teams, right? Well, what they said was, if so many women are being sexually assaulted, are walking around afraid of getting sexually assaulted, and the university is not handling this appropriately, then we are not getting an equal education. And so they sued. They also worked with other students across the country to set up similar, to suit their universities, and they set up a kind of nationwide network of these young activists. She was a journalism major, and she knew that the way journalists cover sexual assault was he said, she said, right? What happened in this particular story? Is she telling the truth? Is he, you know, and it was always a kind of one-on-one thing. She said, I want to change that conversation. I need to get journalists to talk about this in a different way as a national epidemic. And so what they did was, with these other students from around the country, they set up joint press conferences. So you had students from Pennsylvania and California and New Jersey and North Carolina, and all talking about this at the same time, so that the journalists could not focus on just one little story. And she talks about being in class one day, in an Intro to Women's Studies class, on the same day that she appeared on the front page of the New York Times. She and Annie Clark were the ones who, they went to Kristen Gillibrand's office and said, you know, this college sexual assault thing is, you know, we want to talk to you about it. In fact, she tells the story about going to the receptionist and saying, we want to talk to the senator about this. And the receptionist said, that's not how things work. But then two staff members came out, and they just kind of grabbed them and talked to them about it, and that's how Gillibrand took on college sexual assault as an issue. And then this is Ry Young. Ry Young is a trans man who said, I'm sick and tired of having this same conversation about whether there's room in feminism for trans men. I'm done with that. We need to change the conversation to be talking about misogyny and how that shapes all of our lives, and that we really need to rethink the way we talk about these things. So I was really moved by all of these stories. When you read these stories, they are powerful. They show you that people are coming to feminism from all different backgrounds. Sometimes people think feminism is this middle-class, white, college-educated movement, but these folks were coming from all different backgrounds. Many of the working-class women I interviewed were the most eloquent about how this new language that they learned gave them a way to think and talk about what had been happening to them and to fight back against it. So you get these amazing individual stories, but you also get, when you put them all together, you get this beautiful picture of the movement as a whole and the hard work that it is. A lot of students still think you just put something up online and it goes viral and that you've won somehow. But what these stories show you is as one of my interviews said, it's 99.9% mucking through the muckety muck, right? It's knocking on doors, it's getting told no, it's applying, trying to get money and being told no. It's being told that what you're trying to do is impossible. It's, they talk to me about how some of them have pretty big online followings, and if you look at their website, they look kind of slick and famous, and so people think that they have a lot of power and a lot of money, but they're living in these teeny tiny little apartments. They may not have health care. They're worried about their financial viability, and for some of them, that was a very painful reality. They were doing, all kinds of different things. Several of my interviewees talked very movingly about the power of social media and what it is good for. On top there is Cabo Yang. She was the new director of the Minnesota Women's Consortium. She's a Hmong woman, and she talked about how important it was for young Hmong girls, who many get married still at age 16 or 17 and are not supposed to talk to people outside of their families, basically, and that this was a way to get information that they would not otherwise have. And this is Noorjahan Akbar, who is from Afghanistan and really wanted to go back to Afghanistan to do feminist work, but she would be killed if she did. So the only way for her to do this was through online. It was also a moment where there was a lot of tension in online feminism, and a lot of my interviewees were talking about the frustration of what they called the circular firing squad. And they were sort of saying, Rush Limbaugh and other people like that are over there doing immense damage to people's lives, to women's lives, and we're focusing on each other, and we're critiquing each other so hard and so fast and so publicly that it's actually turning people away from the movement. If anyone makes a mistake, they get shamed publicly and they leave the movement, and that's no way to build allies, to build a movement. So they were really concerned that people were not focused on the common enemy. I stopped doing my interviews in August of 2016. Everyone I interviewed thought Hillary Clinton was going to be president. And then she wasn't. And all of my interviewees were shocked, like many other people. But what I discovered was when you went back and listened to their interviews, you actually saw the sort of foreshadowing of what was coming. That these women and men were like canaries in the gold mine. They were experiencing on a daily basis the misogyny, the violence, the lack of caring about women's lives, and they were talking about it, but no one else was really listening. And so when the new administration came in, they were shocked, but in some ways they were not surprised. And their interviews, if you go back and listen to them, help explain maybe how that could have happened. I think it also helps explain how the March on Washington and the Me Too movement could happen so quickly. A lot of the way journalists cover those things is though they just came out of nowhere. Suddenly, women were mad and they were in the streets, and or they were, on Twitter. But the interviews help you see the decades of work and community building and discussion about the interconnections between issues that made these things possible. 2018, of course, was a complicated year where we saw a lot of new women elected to office, but we also had the Kavanaugh hearings, which again, for many of my interviewees, was a sort of kick in the gut disappointment. And so when people ask me, am I optimistic or pessimistic? And it's hard for me to say, but when I see many of the even younger women and men picking up the flag and carrying it forward into all kinds of movements, those are the people who give me hope and make me feel like they'll help us get where we need to go. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. We have time for some questions, so if you raise your hands, and then the microphone's going to come. Just a second.
Hey, so I have been trying to figure out how to organize a panel regarding the Me Too movement. A lot of what I've seen in discussions is how do we move past this? How do we move forward in our places of workplace with making sure that people aren't afraid to be alone with women in the same room? You hear a lot of conversations back and forth about, is it appropriate to talk about that in the workplace and things like that. And so I've often wanted to organize a panel regarding that, about handling that in the workplace. I know it's a sensitive topic, how would you approach curating something like that? And do you think there's a need for it?
I mean, the fact that people are talking about it together in many different boardrooms, bedrooms, I think clearly there is a need to talk about that, and we have not grappled fully with the ramifications of what happened, and we can't focus all of our attention and energy on one jury's decision, So yes, I think there is need to do that. All I can say is I would want to have both men and women on the panel, but beyond that, I guess I don't have any really great idea. We can brainstorm later, but yeah, having people not just kind of, not just HR experts and stuff like that, but real people who are brave enough to talk about it.
Will there be like a second edition, another book interviewing women? Because the first one that you had, this is interviewing women in the 50s. What are the decades again?
So the women that I interviewed, these are women who are well, when I interviewed them a couple years ago, they were in their 40s, their 30s, and their 20s. So they came of age. The oldest of them sort of were in college in the 1980s, and then the 1990s and the 2000s.
So there's like a second edition of women in a different age bracket.
Older or younger? Are you?
I guess older.
You know, I'm not going to write that book. There are one of my. Actually, a lot of people ask me why. You know, why are you not talking about women who were active in the 60s and 70s feminist movement and are still active today? Because there are those women, and I honestly. There's been so much more written about them, and there really hadn't been anything. Part of my motivation was that when I looked at syllabi for women's history classes, they all ended in 1992.
So I guess I'm kind of thinking more towards like intergenerational.
Yeah, well, I think it would be wonderful, to have. I think a wonderful project would be to have the younger women interviewing older women and having sort of conversations back and forth. And so I think there are wonderful books to be written. Whether I myself will do them, I don't know.
Questions? Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Thanks, Rachel, for the interesting lecture. I look forward to reading the book. In your talk this evening, you sort of organized comments around age decades. And so the question is, would you say more about, well, how many women did you interview who were represented in the book? And a bit more about the geographical diversity and also racial and ethnic diversity.
Yeah.
In particular, were the common themes cross-cutting across race and ethnicity, for example?
Yeah. So the book includes 25 interviews. I think total for this project I did about 30 and didn't include all of them for a variety of reasons. They took place in North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, St. Paul, New York City, and Northern California. And there were the racial and ethnic group, I would say, vaguely, not scientifically, but pretty closely aligned with the percentages of the population. In some cases, I think there are more, for instance, black women in the book than are represented in the population. But that's a very good question about the continuities across between groups, and there certainly were some that did go across. This idea that the older women, for instance, did not come out of school wanting to be professional feminists. That was true across the board. I think the notion that there was a sort of need to balance the needs of the older generation and the younger, that goes across the board. There were some differences. So almost all of the black women I interviewed, I think, were running kind of direct service nonprofit organizations, as opposed to, for instance, being media activists or academics or something. And there was a very there's a wonderful interview with the woman who runs Girls for Gender Equity, which is based in Brooklyn, New York. She's a black woman. Her family, I think came from Haiti, and she said that she was really concerned, even within Black feminism, about the fact that a lot of the sort of more famous, they had big Twitter followings and they were sort of big names, but they did not use language. She was working with young girls, many of whom were coming out of poverty in Brooklyn. The language that these Black feminists in Twitter and other things were using was not language that was accessible to the girls that she was working with. And she also didn't feel like those women respected her as for running a direct service kind of organization. And so she was somewhat frustrated by some of the divisions that she was seeing there. There also was, while many of across the board, I would say, people were concerned about the circular firing squad feeling of the internet, some of that was about race, and it was complicated. And so it was somewhat different for women of color than for white women. Because often what was happening was white women were doing or saying something that angered Black women or women of color, and they were getting kind of publicly shamed. So, for instance, I interviewed Emily May, who founded Hollaback. Has anybody heard of Hollaback? It's this kind of amazing organization that is fighting back against street harassment. And so they have chapters all around the world. This is a subject that most of us growing up, like, you just sort of thought, this is yucky, but it's the way of the world, there's nothing we can do about it. But they're determined to stop it. And so, like, they have things where you can, if someone harasses you on the street, you can take a picture of him and upload it to the internet, and it's mapped, and you can tell the story, and they kind of collect data on where this is happening, and all kinds of, and they write policies and do all sorts of things. Well, I don't know if any of you remember this, but a few years ago, a video came out where there's a woman walking down the street in New York City. It shows all of the people who harassed her as she walks down the street. And for about 5 minutes, it was a sensation, because it really shows the kind of horror of walking down the street and having people constantly commenting on you and trying to get you to smile and do all of this stuff. And then someone noticed that the woman walking down the street appears to be white, and all of the people harassing her seem to be men of color. And what had happened was there actually had been white men also harassing her, and for various, I think, really technical reasons, like they didn't get good video of it or what, those guys had all been edited out, and no one noticed. No one noticed that they had edited out all the white men. And so what it looked like was a white woman getting harassed by men of color, and people got really angry that this was not helpful feminist work, but actually damaging work to men of color. And Emily Mays, she didn't make the video, but her organization released it, and she hadn't noticed this problem. And her reputation was nearly destroyed. I mean, she had been a kind of media darling she hates that term, she would be mad at me if I used it. She had been, winning all kinds of awards and all sorts of stuff, and she was torn to shreds. And she and other women, they were talking about, I have dedicated my life to trying to make things better for all women. And yes, I made a mistake, it was stupid, but I have been practically drummed out of this movement, whereas none of these feminists are are talking about Rush Limbaugh over there, right? None of them are taking on George W. Bush. None of them are, you know, they're just taking me on. And I'm trying to do, I did something stupid, but I'm trying to do good. And so, you know, I said that once to I was talking about that to a different audience, and this young black woman said, well, yeah, if they keep doing stupid racist shit, we're going to keep calling them out, you know. And so she was having none of it. She was saying, I'm sorry, that, you know, that is, but I think there's, what Emily said is, I believe that we need to talk to each other when we make mistakes. But I will call someone up and I will say, what you just did or said was wrong, and here's the reasons why. But I'm not going to do it on Twitter. And so that, you know, so there were some complicated racial dynamics.
Let's thank Rachel very much for